second floor when you come to the Speed when we reopen. And without further ado, it gives me great pleasure, and it's really a tremendous honor to welcome our guest tonight, who is Donald Warhola. Donald has been an incredible champion and advocate for his uncle Andy Warhol's work. It's a pleasure to welcome him in conjunction with Andy Warhol Revelation, which, as we've been talking about, is a very special exhibition organized by Jose Diaz, in that it gives people insight into a side of Andy Warhol that many are not as familiar with. We all are familiar with Andy as a pop artist, the creator of Brillo boxes and Campbell's soup cans, but many don't know that he was also a deeply spiritual person that was profoundly influenced by his Carpatho-Rusyn Byzantine Catholic heritage. Donald, I just want to have you say hello and introduce yourself, and I'll get into some questions, but thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Miranda. I appreciate being invited and sharing with our guests tonight. Hopefully there'll be a unifying message here. As Stephen had said, this is a very difficult time in our country right now, and hopefully as we get into these questions and answers, you'll see a side of Warhol that was unifying. And in his case, I believe it was really tied into his spirituality and his religious life. But again, I'm Donald Warhola, nephew of Andy Warhol. I currently am employed by the Andy Warhol Foundation, also serve on the board of directors of the Warhol Foundation, and I work out of the Andy Warhol Museum, the education department.
So, Donald, I feel like one of the most fascinating areas of research that you've embarked on is getting to know the influence of Andy Warhol's early childhood and his early exposure to spirituality, and how that has influenced the duration of his career. So I know you've done incredible research on St. John de Chrysostom in Pittsburgh. And so I was wondering if you could open the discussion with sort of walking us through how Andy Warhol's early years and his early exposure to spirituality influenced his work.
Sure. So just getting to the first part of that, my uncle and my family, I was 24 when my uncle died. So my father is John Warhola, and we would go up to visit my uncle quite often. So I got to really know him well I visited my uncle since I was a baby. So, and in addition to that, my father would always love to tell stories. He was the middle brother, and after Andre, their father, died when Andy was 13, Dad became more of the father figure. So to Dad, Uncle Andy was more like a son, because there was 3 years difference, and he really took over the fatherly role after Andre passed away. So Dad just loved to talk about Uncle Andy, and I would ask him, what was Uncle Andy like as a kid? And he would tell us about how church was so important. Uncle Andy was very shy as a child, and actually throughout his adult life. But when he was growing up, Dad said that he would always have his sketch pad as a kid, and he'd be drawing, and that's what he loved to do. And also, Dad said that he was always so quiet and never swore, and we always thought he was going to be a priest. So that kind of ties in. But we have some pictures, because again, my grandfather came over from Eastern Europe, present-day Eastern Slovakia, Carpathian Rusyn from the Carpathian Mountains, and church was the core of life. I believe at that time over in Eastern Slovakia, it was so difficult to survive. You grew your own food, you were self-sufficient, and you really relied on your religious beliefs, on God, to get you through each day and to protect you. So when Andre immigrated here to the United States in 1912, later it took actually 9 years for Julia to meet up with him here in the United States. There was a 9-year gap, but throughout all of that, the church was the core of the community. And with that, we have some slides. There was the original church that would have preceded my uncle being born in 1928. But in 1910, they built this wooden church. And then some years later, they outgrew that, and they built a brick church, which still stands today. But you can imagine, you come over to this new world, and you really do everything you can. You're making very limited amount of money, but you put all that into the church, because the church is not only where you worshiped, but it was your community. That area of Pittsburgh, Greenfield, was called Russian Valley because of the Carpathian Rusins, Ruskin Durena, and all the other Carpathian Rusins would meet at church, not only for their spirituality, but also for their community. So there's in the next sheet shows you sort of the facts. It's an interesting fact sheet from 2010, where you can see here the prices, the purchase price of the lots. So they purchased 5 lots, which would have been in 2010 dollars, $10,000. That first wooden church would have been moved, and you could see it. Just to move that church so that they could build the brick church was $120,000 in today's dollars, $53,000 back then, $53,000. So again, it gives you kind of a sense of how valuable the belief was, your spirituality, your church at that time. When you look at these numbers, the expense to build the new church was in 2010 dollars would have been over $1 million. So again, it's just amazing to me that the focus was so much on church, and again, this kind of validates that by showing how much they sacrificed to people to build this church. Because again, we estimate Andre probably made between 30 and 40 cents an hour, as well as others in that community. And to put out the type of money on the left-hand column, and again, the conversion in today's dollars, you had to feed your family, and there's other necessities too, but church was right up there as a primary necessity in life. So if we could go to the next slide, we could see that's the present day church. That would have been the same church Uncle Andy would have attended. He was baptized in the old wooden church, but he would have attended this up to 1949 when he left Pittsburgh. And this is obviously the outside of the church, but again, they went from the wooden church to furthermore to build this beautiful brick church that you see. And the next slide gives you insight into the inside. Now, again, this is a present day picture of the inside. This was not this vibrant whenever Andy Warhol went there, but it was very close to it. And really, when you walk in, it's just so stimulating to all your senses. To your eyes, you see that it's very artistic. You see the icon screens. You see there's stained glass windows on both sides. There's icons that just fill the church. In addition to that, you have a very rhythmic chant that takes place with the parishioners. So really, it's the meaning is to really stimulate all the senses, sight, sound. You have incense burning. The priest will use incense, signifying your prayers going up to heaven. So again, just a very stimulating experience. And again, like with myself, and I believe with my uncle too, when you grow up going to church every Sunday, as Uncle Andy did, this becomes very ingrained in you. And whether you leave the church or not, it's still part of you. So in my uncle's case, he continued to go to church when he left Pittsburgh in 1949 and continued to practice his religion. I like the term spirituality because I really believe Uncle Andy was more spiritual than necessarily religious, in the sense that I think he didn't follow all the rules of the Byzantine Catholic Church necessarily, but saw it more as a guidance in his life of how to be a better person, and again used it as a way to guide him through life.
So, and just for the folks in the audience who may not be as familiar with Byzantine Catholicism, what are some just basic tenets that just to help introduce people to this idea and how it might have influenced Andy Warhol?
Sure. So it's quite simple. It's having God in your heart. When we talk about the difficult struggles that we have now, it just reminds me of Uncle Andy in the sense that he really did not judge people, and he, befriended people from all walks of life, all races, all sexual identities. It didn't matter. He didn't see you for what color you were, or again, your sexual identity, or anything else, but what was in your heart. And I believe that was a really big influence of his spirituality. Um, the tenet, basically the Byzantine Catholic Church teaches us to live with God in our hearts and go out and be disciples and set that example through our actions, our behaviors. So, and I believe, again, I'll say Uncle Andy did that. Maybe Andy Warhol did not do that, but Uncle Andy did. I always see it as two personas. There was Uncle Andy, who really never changed to me. Again, 24 when he passed away, and he was the same person that I knew all my life, even though he was becoming more successful. I would read all this, the Andy Warhol persona, if you will, or that perception of Andy Warhol, and it's like, oh my God, is that Uncle Andy? Like that doesn't sound like him. But again, I really believe that it's almost as though that, being Andy Warhol allowed him to kind of, dance around the edges of what he get outside of his comfort zone of where he felt most comfortable through, how he was brought up and through what he learned through the church. If that
So,
makes sense.
absolutely, yeah. And so for folks who haven't, because the show will be coming and opening when we reopen the museum, there'll be works focusing on the Last Supper, on Madonnas, on Renaissance portraits, on the disciples. Jesus appears in quite a number of works. And so the show really focuses on works that were definitely public during Andy Warhol's lifetime, but were not as focused on. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about why do you think the spiritual side of Andy is perhaps less well known than the other side of Andy, or maybe it has to do with that public-private divide that you mentioned. But I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Definitely. I think you put it very well, that public-private divide. And I think, as I see Revelation, what I see is that there's Andy Warhol, but you see that foundation, that religious, spiritual foundation kind of eking its way out here and there. For example, and again, there's much debate about how this church experience as a child influenced Andy Warhol's art. As you can see here, again, this icon screen is very beautiful, artistic. It was more, or I should say less graphic back in the day. It was still as big, but there weren't quite as many icons. There wasn't as much gold. But again, I really believe that Warhol, Uncle Andy, looking at this as a child, really it helped him to kind of get those ideas. When you look at, for example, his portraits, those celebrity portraits that he did, I can't help but think that this icon screen influenced that. To have these, take these celebrities and turn them into his icons. And in his own way, adding the color, the vivid color, or kind of elevating them to almost saintly. Again, I admire those people. They are my icons just as much as the saints were as I was, growing up as a child. So I think that influenced his art directly. I believe the gold, and again, it's a debatable, all the gold that you see now was not present when Andrew Warhola went to church. However, there was bulletins, there was prayer cards, prayer books that did use that gold. So that gold, and later on in his life, when he did attend church up in New York with my grandmother Julia, St. Mary's, he would have been exposed to more of that gold and gilding. So as you look at Revelation, as I'm looking at it in my mind, walking through the gallery at the Warhol when it was up, you'll see that come out. Actually, you'll see the original icons, which is really awesome. I mean, you get to see this show that really shows you that early childhood experience of Andy Warhol and what he would have been, what his influences, his church influences would have been. And then, like I said, later you get into these iconic figures and iconic women like Marilyn Monroe. And maybe you juxtapose that to the Blessed Virgin Mary and how you have this very prominent woman in your Christian life, and maybe you're kind of again seeking them out in celebrities, and again just giving that iconic status in that same way. Profoundly, I believe it's really remarkable later in his life when he did more of the religious works, the Last Supper, Heaven and Earth Are But a Breath Away, some of these very profound religious works. But all through his career, to me, he would dabble in different works that were influenced by his religious life. And again, you'll see that in the exhibition. I don't want to give too much away, obviously, go through it piece by piece, but you'll see, again, it's a very great show that does step by step take you through the different years and how Warhol dabbled with that spiritual religious foundation that he acquired as a child.
Well, I want to make sure people have time the audience has time to ask questions, but I feel like I have to ask about the factory. I know
Right.
you've told me that you worked there as a young man and got to be exposed to that. So we would love to hear about what it was like to be there and experience that environment.
Sure. Yeah. So, Uncle Andy was so accessible. When we'd go up to visit, he was always there. He was always very kind. A lot of people would ask me, wow, you must have been freaked out by your uncle. It's like, no, he was Andy Warhol. He was Uncle Andy. He wasn't Andy Warhol. He had a great sense of humor, very kind. But in '86, about 6 months before he passed away, we visited the factory. And again, by that time, it was more of an office setting. It was Andy Warhol Enterprises. And I noticed in 1986, which wasn't uncommon, that he was not computerized. There was no personal computers. There was Rolodexes, typewriters. And I had just graduated with a computer science degree. So I kind of was, again, Uncle Andy had a great sense of humor. So I figured I would, kind of tweak him a little bit. I said, Uncle Andy, where's the computers? Like, come on, you're Andy Warhol. You should be on the leading edge, right? I said, I'll come up and I'll install computers for you. Like, come on, I'll get you into that realm. And he loved the idea. He's like, sure, that would be great. So I worked in 1986 for Uncle Andy and installed a computer network. But it was interesting. And again, I didn't know what to expect coming from Pittsburgh, just graduating college and arriving in New York. And it was a very very energetic environment. There was a lot of young people. Uncle Andy loved to have young people in a very diverse environment as well. And he just loved to have, especially young people working there and getting ideas, fresh ideas. And, but there was a serious work theme there too. It was about work and, promoting and doing art and, yeah, and then again, there would be celebrities coming in and out, and me as a 24-year-old, it was like, oh my God, how do I act? What do I say? Debbie Harry comes walking down the hall, like he's greet her, good morning, Blondie, or Miss Harry, or and I tried to act, like I fit, right? Like I didn't want to stand out, so it's probably just high, But it was, to me, it was surreal walking into this world of Andy Warhol. But again, it was a very serious work environment. It was very much as the letterhead stated on Uncle Andy's stationery, Andy Warhol Enterprises. And it was run very much by that time, very much like a corporation, sort of, as a business more than the crazy factory days of the 1960s. But it was a great experience. It was great to get to know my uncle, sort of to get to know the Andy Warhol of Uncle Andy.
That's amazing. Well, I want to make sure folks from the audience have time to ask you questions. So
Sure.
at this point, I'll open it up. I certainly could ask more, but are there any questions from the audience that we'd like to? Does anyone? Or you can also write in the chat bar if you like.
Go ahead.
So one of the things I've noticed is there's color similarities sometimes to Byzantine and Greek Orthodox art, particularly the blues. Have you noticed that as well, being a member of a family that comes from that church? in terms of the color choices that he does. For things like even Marilyn Monroe, some of the color choices remind me of going into an Orthodox church or Byzantine church and seeing the big Virgin Marys.
Yes, actually, the Orthodox Church is very similar. Actually, the Orthodox Church is more similar to the Byzantine Catholic Church than the Roman Catholic Church. So Byzantine Catholics did not modernize, if you will, as the Roman Catholics did. So yeah, I never noticed that exactly, like from a color choice, but that's an interesting point that I'll have to explore. But I will say that I think that's, again, a topic of Andy Warhol that's not really visited as often. I just believe he was a master of color. And again, when I look at the church now and throughout, even when I grew up, color was so important to sort of magnify and accent different religious works and icons that I think that, again, he borrowed some of that technique and incorporated into his art, especially the celebrity portraits.
I think there's a really interesting question being posed by Sandy Haidt. How did Warhol feel about a church that may not have approved of his lifestyle? Did this affect his faith?
Yes, and that's why I believe that he was more spiritual than religious. I mean, I think both. I mean, put it this way, one example is that every morning, like I grew up, again, I was born in 1963. I would visit my uncle in the 60s, and during that time, my grandmother was still alive. And I remember my uncle, each morning before he left, he'd kneel down in front of a cross and say a prayer with my grandmother. Basically, under the premise that you ask God to bring you back safely. My grandmother had this great saying that life is very fragile. It's like on a thread. So I believe that he really used, his religious beliefs to feel that he was really being protected. But I'm sorry, and I lost track of that question.
Well, I guess I think the question gets to the heart of the fact that the church may not have approved of everything Warhol did, and so how did he contend with the fact that there was perhaps a tension between Andy Warhol persona and what the church might have publicly sanctioned?
I believe I know that, again, this is a very popular question. I believe he looked beyond that and he saw that, look, I'm a human being. Above all, I'm a human being, and that God is not judgmental, and that God loves all humans. And I believe that he was not totally comfortable with it, but it didn't deter him. When I was working for him in again, 1986, I would call my uncle on the weekends if I didn't visit him, and he would ask me every Sunday, did you go to church today? So I know there's quite, I've read anything where he was an atheist, he didn't practice his religion, all this and that. And again, I find the problem with that because I know he did. I know he to what degree. I mean, I even read where he worshiped crystals more than he worshiped God, which I just don't believe. Based off of my own encounters with my uncle. So again, getting back to that question, I think that he probably struggled with it, but it didn't deter him from the rest of his belief. And I think he looked, you don't have to agree with everything that, in my opinion, you don't have to agree with everything the church teaches, but you can still be a follower. I think he took what was most important, and that was, again, to have God in your heart and to not, I think he used that to kind of motivate him to not judge people, because again, as a Carpathian Rusin coming over here as a son of immigrant parents, he faced discrimination. There was a different type of it. It was an ethnic discrimination, not racial, of course, but there was, and he knew what that felt like to be the other. And growing up, as a gay young man, I'm sure he felt as the other there too. He couldn't be himself. So he knew how painful that was on many levels. So I think that really, along with his religious teachings, allowed him to just be so accepting of everyone. and even to a point of, people would come to him with problems and say, Andy, gee, what should I do? This is what I'm facing. And, he took on that role as well. But he really modeled that behavior to me. To me, he saw each individual as a child of God, and they're unique and special. And to me, he wanted to know what made you special. And again, if we look at people like that, if we don't judge people, we look at people that way, it makes life so much more enjoyable, right? To be able to say, wow, I wonder what their story is and what makes them unique and special. So that's what Uncle Andy taught me as I was growing up. And I cherish that because he modeled this behavior. Again, a very generous man, a very kind man. Besides the Warhol, again, there's so many stories where he used people, he did this, he was that. Again, I didn't see that. Was he perfect? No, he didn't walk on water for sure. But to me, the Andy Warhol that I knew, the Uncle Andy, was a positive role model in many ways.
I guess along the lines of, wrestling with his immigrant background, Elaine Stern has asked, why did he drop the A in his surname, the Warhola?
Right. So good question. Early on, he dabbled with that. We have some early drawings that he did in high school and even earlier where he would sign it maybe A. Warhol or Andy Warhol. And again, I think my belief is that, as a child, he loved the movies. At 11 years old, he would go out to the cinema and he would write to movie stars, get autographs. So again, being very poor growing up, it was a big thing when he was 6 years old. They moved into a brick house and he had a bathtub. He had an indoor bathroom. That was a big deal for the Warholas. So I think he knew there's a better life out there, and I think he would go to these movies and really glamorize these movie stars, and Shirley Temple was one of his favorites. So I think he dabbled early on with, if I was a movie star, what would my name be? What would I go by? And then later on, he told my father, he said, I believe that I'm not getting, as in the 1950s as a commercial artist, he told my father that I believe I'm not getting as much business as I could because of my name is too ethnic. I want to make it more American. I'm going to drop the A. And so he did. So again, here we go again, where, there's this ethnic discrimination that he faced, that he just thought that, his name in that period was too ethnic. And so he went with Andy Warhol. I just believe, Miranda, with Andy Warhol, with my uncle, he was very complex. He appeared to be very simple in many ways, but just a very complex individual, and he did nothing for any one reason. I think if anyone who says, Andy Warhol did this because of this, I just say, no, that's too simple. He may have projected that image, but I believe there was a lot of thought. And again, he was just very complex in the sense that anything he did was for multiple reasons. So again, I think, getting back to your original question, it was a little bit about, what's my kind of pen name or my stage name? What's a really catchy term? Which I really like too, because when you think about it, a lot of times he's referred to as, just Warhol, not Andy Warhol. And back in the day when he changed his name, that wasn't the kind of the custom or the practice, if you will. And now today, we have, whether I'm pretty old, but Madonna, other celebrities that just go by a single name, either first name or last name, or first name. So I think that's, yeah, right. So I think too, he was kind of building his brand and thought, this is going to work a lot better. Andy Warhol, we dropped the Andy, and then we go by Warhol.
That's awesome. Well, okay, I want to leave time for the breakout groups. So Stephen, will you take it away?
Absolutely. So now we'll go ahead and break out into our groups and have conversations about our upcoming exhibitions, the reopening. Thank you, Donald, so much for the insight, and Miranda for the questioning. And I'm really excited to get back to the museum. I saw the big sign across the building today or yesterday when I was over there, and it looks amazing from 3rd Street, so we're ready to get back. So with that, Karen, can you break us out? Thank you.
So lovely.
Juliet.
Hi, Donald.
Hello.
I think there may be 5 of us here. I can't tell. Do one of you have a better?
One,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
7. Okay.
So I went to the Andy Warhol Museum with a group from the Speed a few years ago. We had a group that went, and I remember one of the rooms. I can't remember which floor, Don. Let's say like the 4th floor had like a computer set up in one of the rooms.
Yeah.
Was that similar to maybe what you would set up for him, or set?
No, actually, so the computers I set up were more of a business application.
Oh, okay.
Especially with Interview magazine. So what she started to publish in 1969, what I saw was, Rolodexes where if they were going to do a shoot in a certain city, they would see, what photographers are there, what writers, what, resources we have there. And it's like, and, a lot of writing. So I thought, get rid of the typewriter, what that's like, and also like a database application. Back then, the computer was still archaic compared to what we have today. But I just saw like all this potential. Like, man, you could be so much more productive if you use a personal computer. And to me, that was Uncle Andy. You say those words, productive, more productive. They were probably the 2 best words, or his 2 favorite words, more productive.
Well, it also seems to me that he's so, from what I've read and what I see of his work, he was so inspired by other people's enthusiasm, and so if you were enthusiastic, he probably was like, that's a great idea. I should totally do that. Come and join my work group.
Oh, yeah. No, that's why, again, like he mentored younger artists like Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat. And, Warhol and Basquiat is just a great book that the foundation put out. And again, it's so timely because again, you had this older white uptown artist befriending this young Haitian American artist of color, and Haitian Puerto Rican actually artist of color, and you would never think that they would kind of get along or hit it off, but there's such a synergistic relationship, where you would think too the older artist is going to mentor the younger artist, but it worked both ways. Mm-hmm. Basquiat really helped Uncle Andy, gave him suggestions on getting back to hand drawing and painting and so again and it's a beautiful relationship that they had. It really was. It was
their work is often exhibited together. And I bet there's also a sort of they were each sort of pushing each other to incorporate more words and imagery and icon and layer and respond more to everything that was going on, both in culture and in pop culture too.
Right, and in life. Uncle Andy was really getting Jean-Michel. He wanted him to exercise and to eat healthy, and the stuff he wanted with us. So I mean, I see that it's so Andy Warhol. It's so Uncle Andy. He would kind of look us up and down when we visited. And, gee, it looks like you gained some weight. Like, what are you doing? Oh yeah, he was. And again, like you read all this of this wild partier, and he liked to put out that image. I believe, because again, I always say I believe that Uncle Andy felt, if people knew he was very kind, generous, church-going, God-fearing, that's in his mind. I think he felt that was boring. No one's
that would have ruined his image.
Exactly. And again, furthermore, I think he put out these little tidbits of information, or there's no doubt he went out, he socialized, he was around really wild people, no doubt about that. But then he left you to kind of create the rest of the narrative, almost like seeing himself as a work of art. You look at it, your interpretation, you kind of fill in the blanks. I'll be who you want me to be, then I'll be who you want me to be, and I'll be, not really getting one definitive person. Where again, I believe I have the advantage of having known my uncle as Uncle Andy. And again, that's one of many different personas that I believe that he projected, but it was a true, I think it's the truest persona. Because people would say, I mean, he was very shy, but around us, he felt so comfortable.
I was on the same trip with Juliet, and when Jose took us around, and this is a departure from the spirituality aspect, but I was I had never known about how much his mother had collaborated with him in his work.
Right.
And I think that, and I even mentioned to Miranda, like, this is a ripe area for research. Like, somebody needs to write about that, or maybe somebody needs to curate a show about that.
Right.
I thought that was super fascinating how involved she was.
Oh, yeah.
What he did. Yeah.
Totally. It's like there was just an article about, and again, why the Campbell soup can. I asked Uncle Andy, he said he was just bored.
No, this is what I read. I read that 800-page, biography. I can't remember which person. And he said that the beginning, of course, is all about the poverty of the family. And he would come home from school, and it was a big deal to have a can of soup for lunch.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a period too. So my grandfather died when Uncle Andy was 13. Dad was 17. Dad had to take over again. But a year later after that, Julia ends up in the hospital with colon cancer. And you can imagine in the 1940s, colon cancer is, it's devastating now, but back then she was very lucky to be alive. But she spent several weeks in the hospital. And that's where I think a lot, neighbors, it was, again, how do it takes a village. And neighbors, really a diverse neighborhood, all helped out and got them through that rough spot. But I think that's where, like, the Campbell soup. Other than that, I could see Julia cooking up, the soup. But also that we have a drawing at the Warhol Museum, and we believe it's from the 1950s, early 1950s, where Julia draws 2 Campbell soup cans and a cat, of course, and says, Campbell soup very good, G-U-T. So again, I think there was a combination of many different things happening at one time that kind of gave this idea to my uncle to do the Campbell soup can. Because again, he loved a strong brand. He loved that, that idea of having your brand out there and known globally. And I think he really, he pursued that in his own career. It didn't happen while he was alive, I don't believe. But now, of course, I mean, Warhol's all over. It's like you can't get away from, if it's not a direct reference to my uncle, it's Warhol-like art out there that's really, neat.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Now, you were close to him.
Mhm.
What about other family members? Was he estranged with any other family members?
No, it's amazing. Actually, so there was 3 boys in the family. Uncle Andy, of course, he was the youngest. My father, who was 3 years older, and my other Uncle Paul, who was 6 years older. And my family as well as Paul's family would visit Uncle Andy regularly. And and my Uncle Paul had 7 kids. So you can imagine, and we stayed with Uncle Andy. Like, he had the patience of Job, I couldn't imagine, that. I mean, even now, I'm the youngest. I have 2 older brothers as well, and we're 3 years apart. But I love it when we sit down and share stories about visiting Uncle Andy. And my brother Jeff, he's 6 years older, so he has a better recollection. But you remember that time I wrote all over Uncle Andy's checkbook, and he just laughed. You remember that time whenever you were jumping up and down on that couch, and Uncle Andy said, "Gee, that's really expensive. That was in a famous movie. You probably shouldn't jump on it." But he was just so low key. I never heard him swear. I never heard him get upset. I mean, he got a little, again, if there was something that, bothered him, he would call you on it, but never yelling, screaming, swearing, putting people down. He that just wasn't his nature. He was very kind person for sure.
Would he ever paint pictures for family members?
No, I have actually, he loved to sign his books, whether it's an exhibition catalog, and sometimes he would draw or sketch in those. I actually, it's at the museum, but I have a portrait that he did of me in 1982. So I sent him my yearbook graduation picture in 1981, and he, in the summer of 1981, and then in the winter of 1982, he completed the portrait. So It's a double portrait. And again, he was very gracious. Oh yeah, I'd love to do your portrait. That's great, you know. So, but I'm the only other relative that he painted, not because that he declined anyone, but, you know, growing up, it just, you know, art wasn't our thing. It wasn't, you know, part of what, you know, we were accustomed to experiencing. So, but I had the idea, I thought it would really be a great memento to have this portrait done. You know, and again, just for kind of selfish reasons, like, gee, I'll never be able to afford to have my real portrait done, so I should have Uncle Andy do it. So, he did it. Yeah, it's, you know, a lot of great memories. Now when I think back, I have nothing but love and gratitude to Uncle Andy for, you know, again, like I always say, he gave us what was most important. That was his time. You know, he would love to surprise you. We would visit, you know, he would save something that he thought you would really like. And again, it wasn't about, you know, I'm going to give you this expensive work of art, because he knew, like, what are we going to do with that, right? Now I know what I would do with it, but as a kid, but I remember, you know, again, you have to, in the context of the time in the 1970s, where right after Easter, we visited Uncle Andy, and he saved this big chocolate rabbit. You know, it must have been about this big. And again, it's like he knew that we might have got one chocolate rabbit in our Easter basket, and that was it. You know, you didn't dare even ask for more, but that was plenty. But he knew we would be blown away by this huge, you know, and again, back then it was. Today that's probably the small chocolate rabbit that kids get. But he just knew, like, he saved these. Oh, I got something for you guys. You're gonna love this. And he just wanted to see our reaction to it.
It was probably a solid bunny as a
Yeah, right. And again, it was just something that we, like, as a kid, was like, oh my God, this is amazing! Like, so much chocolate. I you know, I'm not used to this. So he would find ways of you know, surprising you and giving you gifts. Like for me personally, I wore his size in his clothing size in high school and first year of college. So he would give me his hand-me-downs, which were awesome. I mean, I still have a collection of. I'm going to be doing actually a talk for the Warhol Museum on some of those gifts that he would give me. And, you know, to me, it was great. Like, man, you know, at the time he wore Levi red tag button-down jeans in the 80s. And, you know, you couldn't really buy those in Pittsburgh, here in Pittsburgh. You had to go to New York, and they were way outside of my budget, right? Or my parents' budget, I should say. But he would give me those, and I was so happy. And he just loved to see that. You know, it was reminiscent of him as a child. He was the youngest of three, and he wore hand-me-downs. That was a big part of growing up. So I think that took him back to his childhood, because again, we would be leaving a visit, and he'd say, "Oh, wait, I have something for you," and I'd be like, "Yes," you know. And he'd come out with 2 shopping bags. You know, some new. Like it's funny. Like, he was very frugal. So I had more jockey underwear than I could even use, because he would find it on sale, and he knew I wore the same size. So he would buy, like, whatever, 30 pair, you know, and then he would give me like 15 pair. I go, these were great. This is a great deal on these, you know, and I bought them. So again, growing up very poor during the Depression, that never left him. As well as, again, just his religious beliefs, that spirituality that he had ingrained in him. Which you'll see in the Revelation show, just never left him. You know, and again, he dabbled, he danced, he however you want to put it, on the fringes and outside of his comfort zone. But still, I don't think he strayed far away. But he was so misunderstood. Even the priest who gave his eulogy for the funeral said, you know, Andy strayed away from the church. But that wasn't true. Because he did go. I mean, after at his memorial, we talked to the priest of St. Vincent's Roman Catholic Church, which was right around the corner from his house on East 66th Street. And we'd go in there and, you know, visit the church. And Uncle Andy told us, he's the one that said, you know, hey, I always stop in St. Vincent's. You should stop in there if you want to see a beautiful church and if you want to say a few prayers. And that's what we would do. But, you know, and again, he kept that hidden. You know, again, he didn't sneak around and at midnight and go in, but he just didn't talk a lot about it. So again, that was, and the priest at the memorial said, you know, gee, he was talking to my father. He said, I'm going to really miss talking to your brother. You know, Andy would stop in and I'd be cleaning the church and I would just see like a shadow and I see it's Andy. Very quietly, he would say a few prayers, we would chat, and then he would go to work. So again, he didn't attend, you know, liturgy on Sundays, but he would stop, I believe, every day, according to the priest, to say a few prayers. So.
Well, we're actually about to close out this breakout room. So in just a few seconds, it should give us a notification and we can all go back as a full group. But thank you, Donald, for answering these questions in this group. So I'll see you all back there in just a second.
All righty. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to wait for the other groups to join us.
If there's any other quick questions, I can answer.
What was it like meeting Debbie Harry or just walking past her? Because I love her.
Yeah. No, actually, I met her a couple years ago, too. Her and Chris Stein, believe it or not. Yeah, they visited Warhol. So,
I mean, they've been great.
Yeah. So that was really neat. You know, again, I was working up there, so I didn't, like Duran was coming through, Hall & Oates, Rick Ocasek. I mean, that was really cool. I was in the lobby. I was going home one night, you know, from the factory, and Uncle Andy was sitting there with Rick Ocasek. And of course, I knew exactly who it was from the cars. Yeah. But I didn't know how to act. Again, like, what do you know, I don't want to be, oh my God. So I was, Uncle Andy said, oh, Donald, come on over. I want you to meet a friend of mine. This is Rick Ocasek. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. Is it Rick? You know, again, I wanted to be cool, I guess, or act like.
Was he with Paulina? Was he with Paulina back then?
Yeah, that's what drew them together, because Paulina was from the Czech Republic.
Yeah.
Czechoslovakia then. And so anytime, even like anytime Uncle Andy would meet any celebrity, like Sissy Spacek, I know that, you know, Uncle Andy was like, oh, he couldn't wait to tell my father, you know, she's Slovak, you know, she's from Eastern Europe as well. So anytime he found that out, there was an automatic, oh, wow, like, you know, we have something in common, something to talk about. So, yeah. But again, it was fun. It was surreal to meet these different celebrities while I was up there. But Debbie Harry was really, she's kind of, you know, she's cool. She's like, you know, not real, like when they came to the museum, Chris was really like, you know, forward and here's my email and keep in touch. And Debbie was more kind of stand back-ish, but she was fine. Like, again, I'm not judging, because, you know, they get people coming up to them all the time, and, you know, their private life just probably doesn't even exist. So, and then you have to maintain your kind of your image. So, no, but she was fine. But Chris was much more forward and friendly.
Well,
Donald,
I just
are the wall behind you, are those Warhol paintings?
No, actually, it's Max Giblett. Are you familiar with?
I'm not.
Okay, yeah, he was actually an artist who came to the Warhol to visit, and he did a workshop, and these were kind of like the leftovers, if you will. and
I love it.
I love them. Yeah, he's he draws with a lot of spirituality, and, you know, he's pretty intense. If you YouTube him, from New York, Max Giblett. I didn't actually get to meet him, but because I started at the museum right when his show was closing, so I didn't get to see his workshop. I love his art.
That's great. I love them. Do we want to take one more question before we sign off to everybody? Is there something?
Fine. I'm fine with as many questions.
We have one question, Donald, from all of Group 5, which is, if they were to read any biography about your uncle, which one would you recommend?
That's really hard. That's not even the ones that he wrote. I don't believe. I mean, I know Blake Gopnik just published a new biography, and I just kind of dabbled in it. I think he did really a lot of great work in putting together a lot of factual information. I don't agree with everything I've read so far, so that's a really good question. There's actually a book too by Matt Rubicon, who worked at the Warhol Museum and Archives. It's called A is for Archives. So that's, Matt was great. Unfortunately, he did pass away last year, but he worked with the museum before the museum was even there. But he had this great understanding and knowledge of Warhol, where you could go up to Matt and say, November 1975, what was Warhol doing? Oh, well, he would have been in Paris for this show. I mean, he just had this canny ability and knew Warhol inside and out. So his book is a great reference book. I mean, it's not going to kind of tell the story of Andy Warhol, but more like the story of Andy Warhol through his archives. So I would highly recommend that book.
That's good. And we'll have a catalog available for the exhibition that is just amazing. I was fortunate enough to get one when Stephen and I were up in Pittsburgh to see the show. And I can't tell you enough how much this really means to us. I think the time is really great for us to have this exhibition. And I just want to remind everybody before we close to really be gentle with yourselves. I mean, be kind to each other. It's a tough world right now, and I really mean that. And hopefully, through the power of the art and the exhibitions that the curators are planning, that we all get some refuge and some inspiration out of that. So thank you for that. And I hope you all will join us next Friday.
And if I may, just again, as I mentioned, like I believe Uncle Andy looked at individuals as each individual is unique and special, and trying to find that gift that person has. What makes them unique and special, and try it. I mean, try it for a day, and it's really refreshing and it's positive. And again, I don't want to get too cliche or on this soapbox, but I really believe that that's how Uncle Andy saw individuals. That's at least what he taught me. And if you do that, it takes a lot of that negative stuff that we're surrounded by, and just really dissolves it. And again, just a much more pleasant way of living our lives, being gentle to ourselves, but others as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for allowing me to put that out there.
Of course. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thanks.
Thank
so
you.
long.
See you soon.
See the show.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Donald. This was amazing. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
I hope it turned out okay.
A great event.
Yes.
Really what we needed, I think. Thank you.
I think it was a good decision to go on. Like I said, I wanted to, and Miranda and I talked about this earlier in the week, that you get that message out about how Uncle Andy just saw other people. It was, and again, you could look at his life. There's many testimonials of that, of how he treated. Again, there's this picture. Do we have a minute or two?
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
there's the one copy of Interview magazine where there's this African-American model in the early 70s from Pittsburgh, and her name escapes me, but he put her on the cover of the Interview magazine. And it's the only cover that I'm aware of that Uncle Andy is there taking her picture. So again, putting a woman on the cover in the early 70s was kind of risky, right? But a woman of color, and Uncle Andy was there taking the picture, almost like making the statement that, no, I condone, this is my idea. This is what I wanted. This didn't happen when I left and someone snuck it in, So he was always, again, I think just being the other growing up and feeling that way, that he had a real compassion for people that were, marginalized in any way. You have the ladies and gentlemen paintings that he did. You have this example, and many others that, he took on those very difficult subjects and wasn't afraid to give visibility to those that deserved visibility. So again, I really admire him so much for that part. And again, I think that's all rooted in his spirituality and how to be the person that he was.
That's a great, thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you again, Donald. Good night, everybody.
Good seeing everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.